Hello and welcome everyone to the Solo Multimedia Podcast where I give you my unfiltered takes straight off the cuff. And today I'm going to be talking about a new show called The Rehearsal. It's just got released on HBO. It was being released like weekly. Season 1 is all out though, it's only 6 episodes. And the reason I knew about the show was because essentially recently, I made an episode about this a while ago actually. Recently I got around to watching Nathan Fielder, which is a Comedy Central show, essentially about so it's a guy called Nathan Fielder who goes to businesses and pitches just like wacky ideas. It's kind of like, imagine almost like Borat hosting something like Gordon Ramsay's, I think, Kitchen Nightmares, the one where he goes to failing restaurants and tries to help them. It's basically that. But it's an incredible show, and I'd highly recommend it to anyone, honestly. It's like one of the funniest shows I think I've ever seen in my life. It's got a shockingly good amount of purpose and like thematic weight to it, surprisingly enough. I finished it maybe, I don't know, like 2 weeks before I discovered that the rehearsal was about to be released, and it was before any of the episodes had been out. But the whole thing's concluded now. It ran over 6 weeks, and I have quite a few thoughts on it because following up Nathan for You, I think, is one hell of a difficult task because that show's just, it feels like almost such a cult classic. Like everyone I speak to who knows about it ranks it like pretty highly in terms of their best, favorite shows of all time. And I would definitely consider it like very, very high up there for sure. It's also one of the funniest things I've ever seen, period. It's just fucking hilarious. Pretty much every episode is at least like very funny. And then the absolute best have me cry laughing basically the entire way through. It's an incredible show. I highly recommend it to everyone. So the premise for this show, the rehearsal, is kind of a bit difficult to explain if you haven't already like watched it or seen a trailer or something. But essentially, the idea is Nathan finds people at pivotal points in their life, or finds people that have some kind of like social interaction they need to get through, that they aren't quite ready for. Like it might be something that's particularly heavy, or it might just be something that they've been, hiding from friends for years or something like that. And the idea is that he gets them to rehearse the interaction, the conversation about whatever it's going to be about in some kind of replica environment with actors, an actor playing the person they're speaking to. They always plan it to be in a certain place. So, for example, in the first episode, there's a guy who comes on from a Craigslist advert and says that he's been lying to his trivia pub group, his friend group, about his educational background. Basically, he says he has a master's degree out of like social awkwardness. But then it turns out, he didn't have a master's degree ever, and he wants to come forward like 10 years later or something ridiculous like that to one of his friends. So they rehearse the entire thing with an actor playing his friend in a perfect replica of the pub, essentially. That's kind of the first episode, and it sets up the premise for the show. But with it being Nathan Fielder, A, the awkward comedy is just fucking incredible, and B, it is shockingly like interesting as a show, and it goes into so many interesting little places. The way the show develops is very, very surprising too. I think one thing I will say is if you've seen Nathan for You, and you've seen the final episode, which is called Finding Francis, that almost feels like a prototype of what this show would essentially be. So I'm going to spoil basically this entire show because it's really hard to talk about it without spoiling it, I think. If I had to pitch it in one word, this is kind of like, I heard like YMS described it as this, and I actually think it's very apt, especially when you get into the later episodes. It's kind of like Nathan Fielder does Synecdoche in New York. So if you don't know what that is, it's a film about a guy who essentially, he's a playwright, and he gets a grant from the government to put on a theatre production, but it ends up taking so much time and gets so overly elaborate with like actors playing actors and this really insane kind of like recursive New York setup where they've got a huge, essentially the stage is like all of New York. He builds a replica New York in like a warehouse, and then in that New York there's another replica warehouse, and it's very absurd and surrealist, and it's also another film that's quite hard to describe. But a large part of that show is about the kind of performances that the actors are doing, trying to replicate real life people, and trying to kind of comment on the way people perform in real life and all that kind of stuff. Basically, it just really delves into humanity in a lot of different ways and how humans act in society and all that kind of stuff, right? And this is kind of the same thing, but with a more comedic edge. or at least that's where a lot of the appeal of the show is, like having someone come in and rehearse something that they know is being filmed for TV, they know is going to go on HBO. It's a very like big production, clearly, because they've got all this money to throw behind it. But ultimately, they're acting out something that is a sincere moment in their life, right? It's kind of a large theme of the show. But yeah, after episode 1, things kind of go off the rails way quicker than I expected, and it just gets far more absurd than you'd ever imagine. So, like in the second episode, it steps up from being about individual people going through certain circumstances, and he actually builds an entire replica house and brings in a person who wants to rehearse essentially raising a child. So they have a bunch of child actors that come in, and she has to kind of raise them, raise them over the course of, I think it was like, I want to say it was like 2 months or so, maybe a bit less than that. I can't remember for sure. And then like every day the kid, or every like couple of days the kid ages, I don't know, like 3 or 4 years, something like that. So they start out with really, babies, and then toddlers, and go to like young kids, then gets teenagers, and all that kind of stuff. So it's it's a very strange premise for a show. I still can't quite believe he got the budget and the green light for this, but I'm so glad he did, because it's such a unique show as well. Like the fact that it hits in such a like heartfelt way, almost. Like there's a lot of moments in the show that are very sincere and feel very real, but at the same time you've got Nathan's whole deadpan shtick, you've got absolutely absurd scenarios happening. There's a couple things he does on the show that just drag people into like some of the strangest places. So in the third episode, I think the third episode for me was really where the show started to really make a lot of sense. Because the first two were like, okay, this is an interesting premise, but I don't really know where it's going from here. But in the third episode, what ends up happening is, so Nathan decides to step in because basically the person who's trying to raise a child is looking for a man to raise the child with her, essentially. And she goes on a couple dates with one guy, is very funny. I'm not going to spoil any of that because you should just go watch it. Honestly, it's very funny. But because she's not having any luck there, Nathan decides to step in as like a platonic partnership, or a platonic partner to raise the kid with, essentially. It's kind of like a strange situation, but he decides to step in, and the third episode is kind of centered around him balancing his work life, which is running the show The Rehearsal, and his rehearsal life, i.e. him being in the show The Rehearsal. So it all gets quite meta at points as well. That's another like big part of the show. But the real kind of like core of the episode is centered around his work half. So when he goes to work, he's helping someone who is being locked out of their granddad's inheritance by their brother, because their brother essentially believes that his girlfriend is a gold digger, so he won't give the inheritance to his brother, because of his girlfriend. And this is something that apparently was in the will of the granddad, which is, I have no idea where Nathan finds these people, but that's just truly hilarious to me. But either way, what ends up happening throughout the episode is they rehearse over and over again, and the guy that Nathan gets, that's after the inheritance, can't stick to a strategy. So in the previous episode where he'd gone through a rehearsal, he creates these like incredibly elaborate flowcharts that handle every different situation they can, like whether it goes flirty, how to defend against that. If you wanted to go flirty, like what way do you go with it? And he's got all these prepared kind of like lines and jokes and strategies to make everything go as smoothly as possible. But in this episode, the person who's trying to get the inheritance can't stick to a particular strategy. He can't seem to commit a certain set of lines or jokes or whatever to memory, or I guess it wouldn't be jokes, a bit more of a serious tone than admitting your master's degree is fake, I suppose. But either way, one of the things that Nathan realizes halfway through the episode is that essentially he can't prepare this person for the emotional impact it's going to have on them. He kind of realizes that like having someone rehearse everything in a completely clinical setting may help you improve on a strategy to navigate the conversation, but it doesn't prepare you for the emotional weight of actually doing it in real life, which is a problem he had in the first episode with the first person. They kind of like stumbled a little bit. It all went fine in the end, but there was a couple moments where it really could have gone awry. So what Nathan does is he tells the actor playing this guy's brother to out of character, ask the person who's there rehearsing to come and help, because his granddad needs him to move a generator and he needs a couple extra pair of hands, basically. So the actor takes the real life person out of character to his granddad's like barn outhouse type place, gets the generator, gets them to all move it. But what he doesn't tell him is obviously that the granddad's an actor and the whole thing's set up. They keep the filming crew around, but they kind of explain it on the show as like, oh, they're filming a documentary. The actor explains it to the granddad in character, so it looks real to the person who, to the person who's actually part of the rehearsal. And then what ends up happening is the granddad, after they sort the generator, the granddad asks if those guys could stick around with for to help him with something else, essentially. And the son of the grandson, my bad, basically says that he can't do it tonight because he's got a date. There's no way he can stick around, so he leaves. The granddad's kind of annoyed about it, but the real life person in the rehearsal opts to stick around. And then the granddad reveals that he has a treasure map to a bunch of gold that he buried to hide from the government so it didn't get taxed. And he wants help finding this, digging this treasure up, and essentially like being able to pass it down to his children or whatever. So the actor, not the actor, so the real person, the person that's part of the rehearsal, ends up running around the forest late at night with this granddad, trying to find this gold, eventually finds it, forms a bond with him, and then the granddad says to the guy doing the rehearsal that he's willing to let him in on part of the inheritance because, in his words, you've been kinder to me than my own grandson has been for the last 5 years or whatever. So this random guy who's in to do a rehearsal, they make him think that he's going to get another set of inheritance from a granddad, who the next day they reveal dies in a tragically hilarious kind of, obviously it's puppeteered, but from the perspective of the person who isn't an actor, in a hilarious kind of twist of fate. The actor playing his brother withholding inheritance is now also a person withholding inheritance because of all the things that this guy said about his girlfriend, and he now believes that his girlfriend is a gold digger. So that's the kind of like insane shit that you're going to catch on this show. That's where the show really, for me, like stepped it up a gear and started to reveal what it was trying to do a bit more. And even then, like I'm actually just not going to say anything about the back half of the season because it's just you should watch this show. If this sounds interesting up until this point, you should definitely watch this show. It's one of the most unhinged bits of TV I've seen in I don't even know how long, like maybe ever. It's absolutely wild, borderline like I think that episode putting that much weight on one person. In the end, it seems like I don't know if he fully believed the situation he was in. They kind of spin it like the guy just dropped all contact, but he was clearly emotionally impacted by it, regardless of whether he believed it was real or not. And it's almost like it's almost to the point where I wonder about like the ethics of that is kind of insane when you think about it. But regardless, it makes very, very good TV. It was fucking hilarious and very heartfelt and incredibly interesting. So yeah, there isn't really another show like this. If this sounds interesting to you up until this point, I'd highly recommend it. There's such an interesting exploration of like human behavior, and kind of just brilliant comedy front to back. Like I feel like Nathan, one of the biggest strengths Nathan has is that I don't think I've ever seen anyone be quite so good at rolling with the punches. Like he'll bring in a bunch of real people into a situation, won't know how it's going to go, film everything, and regardless of what happens, he'll manage to make something funny, interesting, and entertaining out of it. He'll string it together, edit it in just such a honestly brilliant way that it becomes not only incredibly cohesive, but just, yeah, very, very funny, very entertaining. So I can't recommend this show high enough, to be honest. I think it's kind of fucking brilliant. I can't wait for season 2. It's been greenlit already, so that's very exciting. Hopefully HBO actually have the money to fund it, because Lord knows they're not doing so hot these days by the looks of things. But yeah, that's basically everything I want to say about it. I'm sure a lot of people on the internet have already talked up this show quite a lot, but I haven't seen quite as much about it as I thought I was going to. And Nathan Few is again shout out to Nathan Few. I think that show almost like goes under the radar a little bit. A lot of the people I've spoken to haven't heard of it or seen it. I'd really recommend it. It's a very, very funny show. So yeah, I think that's basically everything I want to say. Both these shows are brilliant, but this one is new and brilliant, I suppose. But yeah, just listen, everyone. Go watch The Rehearsal. It's really fucking good. Peace out.